So yesterday we unboxed this system here and tried it out a bit, and that being the Atari VCS, specifically what Atari was offering with their own OS, games, streaming services, all of that in their Atari Vault. I don't think that's worth the money that they're asking for it currently at retail stores, going almost up to $400 depending on the controllers that you would like with it. But I could see an argument made on it being a mini PC. However, I am still curious about how it's built and put together and what you would have to do to upgrade this thing, because they said themselves there are spots you can upgrade with the RAM and the storage inside. And well, I guess we'll figure out how to open it up and see what it takes to get there. And while we're in this system, we'll see how well it's built with the cooling and everything else. Guys, you enjoy these videos, make sure that like button helps out a ton. And if you're new here to the Spawn Wave channel, make sure you subscribe down below. Now, right away, we can see that there are 4 rubber feet here. And a lot of times, if you're trying to hide screws, you seriously might just put them under these rubber feet. And it looks like they did do that here. So first step would be to remove these rubber feet. Some of them, looks like they have kind of this sticky like glue sort of there. With the 4 rubber feet off, looks like they have Torx screws. That's right, they of course can't use Phillips head screws. They have to annoy me with Torx screws, so we'll, I guess, remove those. So the bottom was still kind of stuck on there, and I was trying to figure out why that was, and it led me to sort of pull a bit on the back of it, and this just unclips. It's designed to just pop off of there, at which point it looks like the bottom of it, where I just unscrewed everything, would be free. Okay, so now it looks like this comes off. I flipped it back over so that we're looking at the top right now, because it looks like everything is attached and screwed into the bottom, and this actually fell off. This is the front glossy part. It looks like that just pops off with it there. Then we have our top. Looks like our antennas are right here, so that's not a bad spot. Looks like they have a couple of antennas right here, and it just sits like right up top. And that makes a lot of sense for it. That's a good spot. Looks like this is where our M.2 drive would go. It's basically the first thing you see once you take the top off. And if you're gonna be using PC mode with this Atari VCS, and that's what your plan was when you buy it, to do things like load Windows or Linux and run emulators, you're gonna wanna get some sort of M.2 drive in here right away, because you want to upgrade from the 32 gigabytes of storage they give you out of the box. Obviously, you're going to want much more, maybe up to a terabyte, so you have plenty of space. They do have a mixture of screws here. Looks like we have more Torx screws, and then we have some Phillips screws around this fan. So I'm going to remove these, and we should be able to get this metal shielding off. So I unscrewed this metal shielding, and I just want to point it out. The fan itself technically has a spot to go. So when you lift this metal shield up, it won't take it with it, but I would probably recommend unplugging it, just because this is kind of sharp right here. I could see it maybe clipping one of these wires. Anyway, we have that up there. Let me grab this screw that fell out. And then we can see the rest of the board. I'm still looking for where the RAM is. I think the RAM's just on the other side. So we had 6 Phillips head screws around the edges here, 4 of which kind of had the springs just help keep pressure on this plate, which should be where our Ryzen chipset is, and it is there. And it says, we have played Atari today. That is hidden underneath of this heatsink, or this plate. Right underneath of there, we have played Atari. Interesting Easter egg there. And then we have our Ryzen chip directly next to it. Now it looks like they're using a really thin thermal pad right here, and it just broke into pieces. As soon as it pulled away from our Ryzen chip, yeah, it didn't hold up very well. I almost wonder if I can just replace that with either another really thin thermal pad, or, I mean, it's so thin, it might just be replaceable with some MX4 or something, to be honest. But there is our Ryzen chip there. It is described, like I said, on their box when you're first opening it up. Now, I do think the Ryzen chip in here itself does have some potential. Like, we'll probably see people do things with the system, such as overclocking the chip and upgrading the RAM, which we're still working towards here. But I think this, on the PC side of things with PC mode, way more interesting than what Atari has in their out-of-the-box experience. Anyway, a couple screws off there, and we can see our fairly small heatsink, I'll say. I mean, it doesn't seem bad. This has a lot of weight to it, so they're doing their best to disperse the heat while keeping it pretty low profile there. So the way they're trying to have the air flow through their system is interesting, I guess we'll say. I mean, they have this, you can see 90-degree kind of fan duct here to move air through and then out of the back. I'm a little surprised they didn't just go with just left to right, just have air come in from one side and then push it out the other. They really wanted it to go out of the back. Now this chip isn't exactly one that's gonna pull a lot of power, it really won't, but looking at this setup, I think it's like right there. Like they didn't go overboard with the cooling, and you can hear the fan spin up at times, but I do almost wonder if that's more so with how they are trying to angle air out of the system as opposed to just the overall heatsink and fan itself. So there's 3 more screws, it looks like, holding this board down, and I think that'll get us to the RAM. It seems like a lot to go through to get to the RAM in this system, especially since that's something that they do talk about being able to upgrade. I don't really know how many people are gonna go this far to get to the RAM. I mean, I feel like a lot of people will probably be able to do the M.2 without any real issue, but just putting a door on the bottom that you unscrew and then there's the RAM and you pop some new RAM in and replace the old stuff would have been a much better way to go about it. And there the board comes out and we can see our battery here and then our RAM. I mean, it's almost like they had an idea to do it right here. I'm sure they just have that so that the RAM doesn't like touch any of this metal or short out or something. They were just probably double checking to make sure that's fine, but like, it almost seems like they had that thought process and they just didn't go forward with it. That's weird, but pretty good, good size piece of metal there. And then we have our 2 USB Type A ports that run through ribbon cables to the top. So I've gone this far, I may as well upgrade the memory from the 8 gigabytes that they had inside. That's 2 4 gigabyte sticks of DDR4 from Kingston. And I just went ahead and upgraded it to 2 8 gigabyte sticks for DDR4, pushing to 16 gigabytes. And there's our new RAM installed there, which actually matches the board a bit better than the older green RAM that we had, but now is up to 16 gigabytes. However, that worked out well there. Looking over the board though, it doesn't feel like a cheap board, which is good because this is a $300 system. I would hope that it wouldn't feel like a cheap board. And for the most part, it being mostly compact to the smaller mini PC style, there's not a lot of things that will necessarily go wrong. And the fact that the RAM itself is slotted means, of course, you can change that out if you need to, if there's an issue. The Wi-Fi card is modular, M.2 would be modular. The eMMC memory is up here. That is soldered to the board, unfortunately. So if that goes bad, I'm not sure what happens. Most likely it will not though. The only other thing I can see that would be a problem might be your power port back here. I would see these kind in laptops quite a bit, and they would have issues if they were kind of messed with quite a bit in transit when you're using a laptop. Think of the people who have a laptop, they leave the plug in and then they take the cord and they wrap it around the laptop when they put it away. Well, that would put a lot of stress on like this little spike here, and over time it would break. This is a console that probably won't be moved around much, so I think it should be okay. It was just something I noticed as soon as I opened it. But I have to give Atari credit. They actually put together a pretty good little mini PC. I mean, just it's a very simple design. There's nothing too crazy going on here. I think they could have done better with their overall airflow, but you know what? It's not bad. The parts in here are average to good, I would even say. Also, if you're someone who takes it apart this far and that thermal pad breaks on you, I did just go ahead and drop some MX4 on there to see how that makes in terms of contact. Looks pretty solid. So if you do have to change out for MX4 or some other thermal compound, it should be fine. Now, I don't really think there's gonna be a massive difference in terms of temperature overall going from the thermal pad they used to MX4, mostly because the chip itself doesn't pull a lot of power anyway. Oh, also I wanna point out that yesterday I had talked about all of the Atari games in the vault. There were actually more than the ones I talked about and I missed it. There's a tab on the left that takes you to the Atari home console section, and there's even more games in there. You can see me scrolling through them here. So there's probably about double the games I talked about yesterday included with the Atari VCS out of the box. So I figured after I installed the RAM, I would actually check the system out for what most people are going to be buying it for, and that's to load up your own OS. I don't think a lot of us are going to buy this and stick in that Atari OS, that little sandbox environment they set up with all of those Atari games. Most likely we're going to do something like load up Windows or load up Linux and just see how far this little mini PC can go. So I followed the instructions that they had set up on their website, where they have you load up a bootable USB for Windows 10. That's right. From what I can tell and what a lot of people are talking about currently on the subreddit or other forums, you don't
actually load the OS from the M2 slot located in the system. That appears to be mostly for storage. What Atari wants you to do at this time is boot from a USB completely. That's where the Windows environment will sit. And I think that's a little strange given we have that M2 slot, and if you go to try to install Windows to it, because that partition exists with the eMMC memory inside, it appears to make Windows confused and it errors out during the installation. So unfortunately, without some strange workarounds, which includes taking the M2 drive, installing Windows 10 on it, and then playing around with the boot kind of setup outside of the system, this is what we're using currently. Anyway, after getting into Windows, I took a look around to make sure that the 16 gigabytes of memory was found. It was, so good news there. And then I double checked the chip, an R1606G. This is a dual core 4-thread chip from AMD, part of their R1000 line, and it goes up to 25 watts, caps at about 3.5 gigahertz. I'm curious if it'll be pushed further as maybe more and more people look into it with the Atari VCS out now, but this is kind of a lower end chip, so I'm not expecting incredible performance out of this for some of the harder emulation we're going to attempt today. I also want to point out I'm using Windows because of compatibility. However, I know there's a lot of people out there who would prefer to use Linux or something there. You can do that. You can also load up Linux here, and who knows, you might be able to squeeze more performance out of this system. Now, the 3 different systems we're going to be checking out today is going to be the GameCube, the PS2, and the Dreamcast. I would say at this point, just assume that most of these chips, even if they're on the lower end, will play Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Game Boy Advance, Genesis, and so on without too much issue. When we get into more of these 3D-based emulation, it's a little harder and a little more difficult for these chips to do, and that's why these tests are a bit more interesting. I do know several other people are doing tests on these, so I would also look around to see what everyone else is getting with their performance as well. But why don't we start with the GameCube, actually, since this is the big one I was curious about. I said, okay, what can this little chip do if we load up something like Dolphin? So I went ahead and loaded up Rogue Squadron as the first game, and it worked, but there was some stuttering. I noticed slowdown, and while it did touch 60 frames per second quite a bit, there were these weird times where it would drop to like 0 frames, then come back, and I thought about this a bit and wondered if it's because we are booting through USB, and maybe I'll revisit this one in particular if I can get everything on that M2 drive, but it was acting a bit funny. However, when I jumped over to, say, Mario Sunshine with the 60 frames per second mod in it, it actually ran pretty well. Like, it was touching 60 frames per second more times than not and running at full speed, which is really cool because that means if you're okay with the 30 frames per second cap, you can probably even load in some additional modifications and even maybe raise the resolution, since I was using native resolution here to try to get the best possible frame rate. If I capped it at 30, there does appear to be quite a bit of headroom, and you could probably play around with some of the graphical features that Dolphin has. Then I moved over to the Dreamcast, and I have to say, Dreamcast emulation is very impressive right now because I played Crazy Taxi and it ran great. Like, it was super fast, didn't really notice anything in terms of lag for the controller or when it came down to frame drops. No, and Crazy Taxi is all over the place. I mean, it is mayhem, and I had a lot of fun playing it, worked great there. And then Sonic Adventure is another really fast-paced game, obviously. It's Sonic, so running around the loops, running around from the whale, and jumping. Sure, it's Sonic Adventure, so it controls a bit funky at times, but you know what? It runs really, really well. This was using Flycast, and I recommend this emulator completely. It was a great time. And then we jump over to the PlayStation 2, which is using PCSX2, and this is an emulator that still beats up good systems, like to this day. If you have a good system or a mid-range rig now, it's still going to have a harder time with PS2 emulation, depending on how many settings and the resolution, all of this you're playing at. So when I fired it up with the 1606G chip, I was a little concerned that I would get some very choppy frame rates, but for some of them, it was pretty good. For example, San Andreas, surprisingly, was very good. It was between 50 to 60 frames per second, and I think it was completely playable. I even jumped on the bike and started trying to roll all over the place to make the game itself lag a bit or fall down some cliffs and all this. And no, it held pretty steady, so that one was certainly playable. However, when I start going a bit further into something like The Simpsons Hit and Run, you start to see the slowdown and you start to see it struggle a bit. This one was running at about 60 to 70% speed, getting into like the 30 to 40 frames per second, and it was noticeable. This is a driving game, so usually driving games you can notice kind of the fluctuating frame rate a bit more. It's still fun. I think you can still play it and all of this. This is where things start to fall apart a bit for this R1606G. I also quickly tried out God of War, and the opening scene played okay. It did drop down, and when it drops down here, you might lose game speed, so it feels a bit slower in something like God of War, which you do want it to be a bit faster when you're doing all of your combos, but it held up better than I thought it would, since mid to low range PCs will struggle with some of these PlayStation 2 emulation titles, this being one of them. If you start to even turn the resolution up a little bit based on the memory bandwidth that this system has access to, it really starts to crumble. Now, that's not to say you could probably play around with some of the settings, move some things around to try to get better frame rates. For example, with the GameCube, I tried it with a couple of different settings, and I found Vulkan to be probably the best one for it with this chipset, and that's how I was able to get the 60 frames per second in things like Sunshine. So maybe kind of altering some of the settings in these would get even better results, but from what I can tell, GameCube, pretty solid on this system. Then we had Dreamcast, which is really solid, and PS2, which is kind of a mixed bag. Now, in the $300 range, I think the Xbox Series S is still much more capable. The CPU inside is much more superior than what we're dealing with here in this Atari VCS, but remember, that has to go into developer mode that is very limited, whereas this Atari VCS has access to much, much more, whether you're running Windows or Linux, and I mean, it could even have a whole scene that takes off around it if the Atari VCS is able to move more and more units and people become interested in it. But I will at least admit here, for Atari and the VCS, it turned out better than I thought it would overall. I mean, yeah, the chip itself is going to limit it for things like tougher emulation, as we've seen here with the PlayStation 2, or even some harder to run GameCube games. But for the most part, at $300, and what I thought was going to happen with the Atari VCS, they technically exceeded my expectations with it. And I am curious if a community will form around this machine, or if it'll be something that's forgotten about, let's say, a year from now. Or, who knows, maybe it does well enough for them that they come out with the Atari VCS 2? Who knows where this whole thing's gonna go, but let me know what you guys think about the Teardown and some of the emulation here that I checked out today. Thanks guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.